Speaking of that guy Vinay, he like I said, he does some good work. He used to work with this other guy, Dr. Z, who's a complete fraud. But Vinny has gotten better. This guy, Vinay Prasad, has gotten better. He's sticking more to the facts and science.
We're
now.
friends, actually, Vinay. So Vinay and I are so.
That's good, right? So I'm saying he's gotten better. He started out not good, and he was with that Z dog or whatever his name is. That guy's a scammer. But I like Vinay. He's better, but I'm going to show you. So he was fact checking RFK Jr. Maybe you're not the right guy to have on for this then, if you're friends with him. Because
I'm happy to talk about if he gets something wrong, he tells me when I get stuff wrong. It's fair.
Okay, here we go. Oh, okay. Okay, here we go. So first of all, he says this.
Technology people who are all multimillionaires or billionaires, and they have a good discussion each week. I actually enjoy listening to it. They have different points of view, different political points of view. They let people flesh it out. On this week's episode, they bring in RFK Jr., who's running for president, and they give him 2 hours to make his views known on a variety of issues. And because of that it's an unedited interview with RFK Jr., I have the opportunity to go through the claims he made, say what he got right, what he got wrong, what he was unclear about, and I'm going to do a breakdown.
What would have been more helpful is if you would have just, instead of spending 2 hours sitting in here listening to RFK Jr. talk to a bunch of financial guys, maybe you invite him on your show and you ask him some questions, and then you can directly. So I find it very, 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 very suspect that he doesn't do that. Hopefully this video will encourage him to go onward to do that. I know he likes to pretend the show doesn't exist, but I don't pretend he doesn't exist. And so it was really unfortunate, and that's the most generous way I could put it, that he didn't invite RFK Jr. on his show to try to debunk him, because what he's going to do right now is far from a debunking.
Wait, are you not on the, is that just your face?
That's me, that's my face.
Oh, I thought you were on the show with him.
No,
like,
he won't have me on his show, believe me. So then he says, so he starts to go into lockdowns. I think this is what this is about. Let's see.
Lockdowns. RFK Jr. was strongly opposed to lockdowns. He states, quote, "Instead of a public health response to a public health crisis, we had a militarized and monetized response, which is the inverse response to what you would want to a public health crisis." And forgive me if that quote's a little bit off, but that's roughly what he said. I tried to transcribe as best I could.
Now, if that was me, I would be like, wow, that is amazing to hear a leading politician polling at 20% in the Democratic Party with a legacy name like Kennedy telling the truth and blowing the lid off of this horrible COVID policies and the way it was handled and the militarization. And wow, what a gutsy thing for him to do. The only politician in the whole country doing something like that, standing up against big pharma and the establishment. This is amazing. And that's not what he does. He does this.
RFK Jr. added that lockdown was not in the pre-pandemic playbook. Nobody thought it was a good idea. They thought the harms would far exceed the benefits, and it was generally thought to be avoided at all costs. What are my thoughts on this? Well, I think RFK Jr. actually has a point. I'm just going to make a nitpick. It bothers me to goddamn get out that he says he actually has a point. How about just say he has a point that's correct? Why do you got to say actually? Because you have to qualify it. It's cowardly. But anyway, he eventually says that RFK Jr. was right about lockdowns. He actually is right about lockdowns. Actually, like this crazy. So that implies RFK Jr. is a nut and this and that. But actually here, it's okay. It's not a good way to do it, but he did it. And here's what he ends up saying about lockdowns and RFK. This is a nice example of that. So on lockdowns, I will also add that the jury is still out to some degree.
Okay, I don't think the jury's out on lockdowns whatsoever, but he thinks they are. And here's what he says.
As to whether or not lockdowns helped, and if so, under what circumstances, I would think that the final verdict will begin in the next decade or so. Very likely, there may be very specific situations in which...
Okay, so let me bring in Vinay's friend to give him the most generous interpretation of this as possible. Do you think that the jury is still out on if lockdowns worked or not? And do you think it's going to take decades for us to find out?
I think we know that they failed, right?
Oh, okay.
Everyone got COVID. I'll say, like, if you're talking about, like, what do you mean by worked, right? If it worked, if you by mean worked, you mean it boosted the fortunes of people who sell online schooling, right? It worked for that. If you're talking about, like, protected some coddled members of the laptop class and made them feel good and virtuous as DoorDash came to their door and said, okay, they're keeping everybody safe. Then it worked. But for in terms of like actual pandemic policy, in terms of protecting real people, no, it did not work. It's an utter failure. I mean, I should say, like, the thing about just a defense of Vinay, he says what he thinks, right? He's an honest guy. He's not lying.
That's good.
Yeah, I think, and that's something. I mean, that's all I'm asking for.
That's good. No, we featured him on this show many times. We featured he's done good work over COVID, certainly the last year. He's done good work, and we feature him all the time. This is why I'm aware of what he's doing and saying. I follow him.
Yeah.
So, but I think he gave RFK Jr. a short shrift and didn't do a good job.
I think the issue is, like, it's really easy sometimes to look at somebody that's on the outside, a fringe figure, and just dismiss them as if everything they say is always going to be wrong. I mean, I've been on the other side of that, Jimmy, as you know,
yes,
during the pandemic. And it's frustrating because really what we should do is we should be listening to each other, hearing each other. Sometimes we're right. Sometimes we have to, like, in the context of conversation, we learn from each other, right? And if we treat each other with respect, maybe we'll learn things. And I think, I mean, sometimes when I can fall into that trap. Although here he's right about, he's right that RFK is 100% right that the lockdowns were dangerous. Damaging.
But the jury is not out. The jury's in. Lockdowns failed, and they failed miserably. So he's wrong about that. Okay.
Yeah.
So here now they talk about ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine. Now, before I play this, I have to let you know hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin do not treat COVID. In fact, they're just not
they clean
good.
Fish tanks.
They clean fish tanks
and horse gunshots.
And that's it. So I'm not saying that. I just want to talk.
You're not a horse.
I'm not a horse, y'all. But I think there's something interesting that he says. So I guess RFK Jr. talked about both those things on that podcast, and here's what he says.
RFK Jr. is a big proponent of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. And on that issue, I think he's completely wrong. He's completely wrong because the way you validate hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin is the exact same way you validate masks, which is you conduct randomized control trials and look at the pooled point estimate. And in my Substack, I make available two of the largest meta-analyses on these topics. One on hydroxychloroquine, which just shows a stone-cold negative point estimate and confidence interval. One on ivermectin, which shows the same, a stone-cold negative point estimate and confidence interval. This is a pooled analysis of all the randomized control trials. And ironically, it's the same as the Tom Jefferson review on Cochrane and masking. So I'm the consistent party here. I'm going to judge toddler masking, adult masking, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, dexamethasone, all the same, which is in pooled or randomized control trials. Do you improve outcomes? And the answer is masking, no. Hydroxychloroquine, no. Ivermectin, no. Dexamethasone, yes. And actually in people who are mechanically ventilated on oxygen. That's where it works. RFK Jr. doesn't talk about the pooled analysis of randomized trials. He argues in favor of these products by saying, one, that African nations, that people take hydroxychloroquine or take ivermectin, they had better outcomes. But this is really a bit of a stretch. This is very poor ecological data. I mean, we're comparing one nation to another nation. First thing I think you should know, and you all know, is that you do know these nations are not counting deaths the same. And that's a point that the podcast hosts make. You can't really compare Nigeria to the United States. They're not counting deaths the same in Nigeria, okay? We may be overcounting and they're likely undercounting. That's probably the way it is. All of the nations around the world did not count deaths the same. So it's very hard to make country-to-country comparisons. Moreover, there are lots of moving parts. It's not just that they take some hydroxychloroquine derivatives in other countries. They also have different age structure. They have different resources. They have different hospital capacity. They had different patterns of spread and social networks. And all of these things do matter. So I think you cannot justify a drug based on country-to-country comparison. What you need to do is pooled or randomized controlled trials. They've done many, and they are stone-cold negative. So on early treatment, he's wrong. One of the arguments he makes is that if there's any drug that's effective, then they wouldn't have had EUA authority to approve the COVID-19 vaccine. And ergo, that's why they didn't want to declare these two drugs effective. The problem I have with that is that, but the summer of 2020, we did know steroids were effective in this slice of severe COVID-19 from the recovery study, and yet they still had the EUA. So I'm not entirely sold. Is this even true that a drug precludes an EUA? Because it certainly didn't. We had an effective drug.
Okay, so I, as a comedian, am going to push back on him. There's no way they could have got the vaccine emergency use authorization if there was a drug that treated it. And hey, Vinny, why do you think they made everybody think hydroxychloroquine was fish tank cleaner and that ivermectin was horse paste and that people with gunshots couldn't see doctors because of it? Why do you think that was ubiquitous from coast to coast? Every media outlet, every politician, every jagoff in the world was saying, do you think they did that because it didn't work? That's what Vinny's saying. And he's saying that the trials that say those two drugs don't work were perfectly done. They weren't underdone. They didn't give you a low dose. They didn't screw you. They did it all on the up and up because the people who funded those trials didn't have an interest in them. So I know for a fact he's wrong about that. He's wrong about that. They could have got the emergency use authorization if hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin worked. Because if it worked the way the doctors who used it said it did, they would have never been able to get it, which is why do you think they lied about it?
Well, let's say it's just ineffective. They didn't go, hey, those are ineffective.
They didn't go, they was ineffective.
It's poison. It's going to make you go blind.
And you're going to go blind. The hicks are taking it from their fish tank cleaner and they're dying. People are standing in line dying outside the emergency room. All stuff made up. Everything made up. Constantly made up about ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. And he thinks they just did that for nothing. So let me bring in Dr. J. Bhattacharya, and now you give the most generous reading to what he just said. And okay, because you and I both know those studies that they did were not done honestly.
I mean, I think a lot of people did some honest studies. In fact, in early 2021, there was a meta-analysis done by folks who affiliated with Cochrane, Tess Lowry, that actually concluded ivermectin probably worked in 2020. And there were a lot of small-scale randomized studies. I think the key thing to me is that we needed to have an answer, a definitive answer in 2020. Why did we not have one? It's because the NIH, the NIAID, and Tony Fauci did not actually honestly study the issue in 2020.
And why do you think that is?
I have good theories about this. I think they correspond to yours, Jimmy.
That's right.
I think
they were afraid that they would find out something that would make them not be able to get their emergency use authorization.
I think like the issue here is that you had okay, imagine it's July 2020 and you're a doctor. You're seeing a patient that has COVID. There's no good treatment really yet because it's a relatively new disease. You have some randomized studies that are, that are okay, not great, that indicate maybe this will work. There's some physiological reasons that this ivermectin might work, and it's a pretty safe drug if you give it at a regular dose. Why would you not permit people to take it? That's the thing I don't understand. I don't understand why public health figures like Tony Fauci, who controlled $10 billion of funding, didn't use that money to study it definitively and we're running high quality trials. And I don't understand why public health figures in the FDA delegitimize the use of these drugs when we didn't have any other treatment for outpatient COVID. So it's a double failure on the part of public health. To me, the way that early treatment was treated, it's one of these things where, like, I think when you look at it and you step back and because what public health did is they turned it into a political thing again. Horse paste. I mean, that was such. The FDA put a tweet out saying ivermectin is horse paste. This drug has been taken by billions of people. It's cured more blindness than any other drug in the history of mankind. It is a truly a wonder drug in that sense. Now, is it good for COVID? We should have known the answer one way or the other definitively in 2020.
I just want to. So I'm a regular viewer of Vinny's, and I read the comments under his videos all the time, and so they were all agreeing with me. They're upset with Vinny over this video where he quote unquote fact checked RFK Jr. He didn't fact check him. This guy here. And says, dude, you were so wrong at the beginning of Wuhan virus and early treatment. I remember seeing you on Z-Dog channel, and you were so off. Z didn't get it, and for all I know, still is arrogant and clueless. He is. You wisened up, which is commendable. It is. Which is why I feature Vinny on the show all the time. Now he's gotten his head on right. Watching the Dark Horse podcast really educated me on the weakness of weakness of taking both peer review and random controlled trial studies without a healthy suspicion of the reviewers, the designers, the testers, the tests, and the conclusions. He doesn't do any of those when it comes to ivermectin hydroxychloroquine. We need a massive reform of the academic and scientific community before they are worthy of our trust and respect. And that is 100% true. The garbage that even the Lancet was printing during COVID was mind-blowing. And so for him to just not even all I'm saying is his own viewers know it. And that's like, it's got almost 60 likes. That's after a few hours of him dropping that. So people know, right? So I think Vinny kind of pulled a boner on this one. And here's one more thing he says about RFK Jr.
Vaccines. RFK Jr. talks very broadly about all vaccines. His arguments were rather unpersuasive to me. His two major arguments were, one, that they don't need to do placebo-controlled trials. The point is taken that the control arm is often some other vaccine or some adjuvant. It's not just a saltwater injection, but that's not going to affect too many things. It's certainly not going to affect your ability to detect a rare safety signal, because that's going to be affected no matter what the control arm is, placebo or totally inert placebo or whatever they're doing. It's not going to affect the ability to see an efficacy signal on a particular viral endpoint. So I found that to be lacking. The second thing he says is he paints rather broadly that we've seen a rise in chronic disease, neurologic disease, and autoimmunity since 1989. Few things are different in that time span. Maybe cell phones took off, maybe vaccines took off, and so vaccines have to be high on your list of things to suspect. He didn't unpack the argument much further than that, but obviously that argument would be entirely and woefully lacking because, you know,
even though he hasn't heard the argument, he already knows it's woefully lacking. And listen to why he says it.
Berlin Wall also fell right around that time.
Because the Berlin Wall also fell right along the time they got immunity over vaccine. It's the same thing. That is the most garbage bullshit thing I have seen done on CNN, MSNBC, or anywhere else. And he did it on YouTube, and he doesn't have to. And I'm going to admonish him right here for doing that. Second of all, why don't you have RFK Jr. on and let him make the argument before you dismiss it without even hearing it? That's the opposite of science and data research fueled speculation. That's not what he's doing. So let me just play a little bit more, Kurt. Hold on.
That's what caused the uptick in these diseases. Moreover, it's not clear to me what diseases he's been talking about. These are very broad terms. This is not a rigorous causal analysis. And so I think.
So I'm not even going to invite him on the show, which is what you should do. But I bet he wasn't. Well, but let's fingers crossed. Hope he does. What do you want to say?
You know how each of us got our own Berlin Wall that fell near us?
Remember Yeah, we all got our own Berlin Wall. So I'm just going to go under this video again. These are his own people who like him, follow him, get lots of likes on their comment. These aren't wild one-offs, crazies. These are his core audience, just like I am. They say, you start with the false premise that RFK has a problem with all vaccines, and then say he wasn't effective in persuading the audience that all vaccines are ineffective. Well, that's not what his claim is. That's why he wasn't effective in doing that, because that's not what his claim is, Vinay. And that's not what he was even attempting to do. He is narrowly focused on a number of specific vaccines, and I suggest you look more into what his actual thesis is, rather than taking at face value what the mainstream media portrays his position to be. That would be nice. So what he's doing to RFK Jr. right now in that video is what people did to people like you, and people like me, people like Dr. Robert Malone, and lots of other doctors during COVID. He's doing that to RFK Jr. Why not bring him on the show? You know, all the people who've criticized me, not one of them ever brought me on their show to challenge me on the stuff I said about COVID. Not one of them. He's not bringing on RFK Jr. either. And I say, shame on you, Vinay. You started off bad on COVID, you got better, and now you're getting shitty on RFK Jr. when that guy is the leading voice standing up against the establishment's bullshit on this. And so shame on you. And have him on. And if you have him on, I'll congratulate you. But you haven't done it yet, so shame on you doing that dirty, underhanded garbage to a guy who's a truth teller, getting his chin kicked in by the goddamn pharma-funded media that censors everybody. So shame on you. And now here's your friend, Dr. J. Bhattacharya, to say something nice about you. Okay.
Okay, so let me try to defend Vinay a little bit. So I don't think so. Vinay is like he runs the podcast basically out of his home. I mean, he's not like a big budget. So I think if Vinay, I mean, it's like me asking RFK Jr. to be on a podcast with me. I'm just a simple professor, Jimmy. Asking presidential candidates to be on is a big thing, right? So maybe that happens for you, but it doesn't happen for people like me. But I think Vinay I think he actually would enjoy that conversation. I know for sure that would be a productive conversation. That I completely agree with you. As far as like RFK Jr.'s take on all vaccines, I don't know the nuances of it. I suspect it's much more nuanced than people let on. I think you're absolutely right on that. But I'll tell you what's going on in part, not necessarily with Vinay, but just with public health generally. There's this very weird idea that if you let somebody who has heterodox ideas about vaccines on the air, that you're going to somehow cause people to die. That's exactly what public health people say and think. And so there's almost like this taboo that you're not even allowed to interact with them, acknowledge their existence, because you'll boost them somehow just by having a discussion with them. I reject that. I think it's not right. I think if a reasoned discussion with somebody who disagrees with you is likely to produce a much more effective public health response than if you just automatically just say, okay, he's too fringe to interact with. And I think that maybe I don't think that's not where his heart really is, but I think there's some of that tinged into how he's thinking and talking because it's baked into public health. And I didn't honestly have to my full confession, Jimmy. I mean, I didn't really see that until the pandemic. Until I personally faced the brunt of that.
Yeah.
My inclination generally is to speak with people, even if I disagree with them. That's because I just published papers before the pandemic, in scientific journals. In public health, what I've encountered is this intolerance of other people's ideas that is just a terrible, because it just breeds distrust.
Yes.
Like if RFK is wrong, let's have a conversation. And I'm sure he's a reasonable man. We can have a conversation. He'll change his mind, or I'll change my mind. It'll depend on what the evidence says, right? I think that should be the spirit of public health, and that's not what we've had.
Kurt,
you don't think ruthlessly suppressing information generates public trust, and that's why the Soviet Union is still around, doing great?
So here's what I said underneath this video. I said, kind of weird that you don't actually critique RFK Jr.'s position on vaccines, but just the stuff you heard him say on a podcast. You could get him on your show in a heartbeat, which he could.
He could?
I wonder why. Yes.
I want to get him. I didn't think I could.
Mainstream. Of course you could. They're dying for media exposure. He's running for president. They're not, and they bring him on ABC News and then they censor him. Anyway,
so ridiculous.
I wonder why you don't do that. It's because you're afraid he'll embarrass you about the vaccines, because I'm pretty sure that's what would happen. Underneath, this is his own people. Exactly. You're doubtful this guy has done a deeper dive than RFK Jr. on vaccines. I guarantee you that RFK Jr. has done a way deeper dive on vaccines than Vinay has.
Well,
I guarantee you.
You got to dive into the money. See, the science, right. You can't just dive into. You got to dive into the money.
That's right.
Which is funding and controlling the science.
100%. And I guarantee you, Vinny didn't read his book that he just released about the Dr. Fauci and the lies, and that it's got 2,000 or 5,000 footnotes and references. And then underneath there it says, so the entire reason for this placebo to be nothing more than a sugar pill is because a sugar pill is least likely to produce long-lasting systemic effects that might otherwise cloud any results of the trial with the So that's him pushing back on what Vinay said about the placebos, and that's what the RFK Jr. was saying. He's got a lot of, believe me, his points are right. RFK Jr. didn't all of a sudden become a maniac he's getting no money for this. He wrecked his complete reputation and life over this. He was a hero to the people on the left. He was an environmental lawyer. He got them to clean up the goddamn Hudson, for F's sake. And all of a sudden he finds out something that goes against, it's a heterodox opinion about vaccines, and what he's fighting for is vaccine safety. And that's why it's such a disservice when somebody like Vinay does a disservice to RFK Jr. like that, because what he's fighting for is safety in vaccines. He's not anti-vax, just like they called they called you anti-vax, didn't they, Dr. J?
Yeah, I got that crazy label.
Anybody who has a question that goes against the big pharma narrative gets immediately called anti-vax. So it's unfortunate that Vinay did that. Shame on you, and do better. do better. Bring on RFK Jr. and maybe you'll learn something, because I bet you will.
Remember when people laugh about it now, the old commercials where the doctor would tell you which brand of cigarette was the healthiest.
Yes, that's
and
right.
Drink 12 glasses of milk every day.
Remember that? Yeah.
People think that's not how the system works anymore.
It still works like that. So here's one more I'll show you. Someone says his main point about vaccines is the liability waiver for manufacturers. We need to eliminate that. I'm surprised Vinay did not catch that. And so anyway, I'll stop because it's getting uncomfortable. But anyway, anything you'd like to say about
Yeah, I mean,
anything? Go ahead.
I don't know the nuances of RFK Jr.'s position on vaccines. I personally, based on my reading of the evidence, think that like, for instance, the measles vaccine is a very important vaccine for kids to take, and very safe relative to other, like, for instance, the COVID vaccine for kids. So I think having a conversation with someone like RFK Jr. I think is a productive thing. And it should be a sign. I mean, I'm not an expert on the finances of it. I just do science for a living, Jimmy. Right? I think having that conversation, I think, would be a productive thing. Absolutely. Agree. But I think it's very unfortunate that the mainstream media is going to censor and go after someone like RFK Jr. for his presumed position on vaccines, when he's been so right on so many other things that are even more important and vital. The lockdowns, his position on lockdowns is entirely sensible and consistent with human rights. Imagine if that had been the dominant position through the whole pandemic.
It would have made a world of difference. A lot of people would be alive, a lot of less suicides, a lot of less cancers, a lot of less everything, and a lot of less economic pain. You're right. I mean, he was right about that. We should be celebrating we should try to be propping up RFK Jr., not putting a bullshit label on your video that somehow you're fact checking him when you don't even know what his argument is. It's not a fact check. I wish you would take that video down. Dr. J. Bhattacharya, I really appreciate you coming on. I can't wait to have you back on soon. I'm sure there's going to be more to talk about. And we just love you over here.
Thank you, Jimmy. So grateful for you.
I have to say that, of course, that the vaccines are safe and effective, Kurt.
Yeah.
You know that, and they will keep you from getting seriously ill or hospitalized. And that whatever we said here, the FDA is right.
And they give you the most important thing of all, knowing you're better than other people.
Yeah, that's right. Watch my new comedy special, COVID Lies Are Funny, for only $10. Become a member at jimmydore.com. Hey, and we're going to be on tour in Northampton, Massachusetts, Syracuse, Cohoes, New York, Hartford, L.A., Bakersfield, Baltimore, Rosemont, Chicago, and a lot more. Oh, and San Francisco being added very soon. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets. See you there.